Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. My guest today is Jaz Brisack, which I think I'm saying correctly. Am I saying that correctly? All right. And they have written a new book, Get on the Job and Organize. And this is for a show called Everyday Anarchism. I have been really remiss about covering probably the most fertile and vital place where anarchism exists, which is in the labor movement, and especially this brief upswelling. Who knows whether it's over? Everything has been disrupted in the since November. This brief upswelling of unionization, organizing in these previously thought to be unorganizable places like Amazon and Starbucks. And Jaz, you are here today to talk to us about organizing the unorganizable. So why don't you just start with tell us who you are and your story?
Yeah, hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm Jaz. I'm a union organizer. I've been organizing for about 10 years. I started out on the Nissan campaign in Canton, Mississippi with the United Auto Workers, and then ended up going to upstate New York as the organizing director for Workers United Upstate New York and Vermont, and got to work on campaigns ranging from Tesla to Ben and Jerry's, so the full spectrum of corporate behavior. And then I was also a SALT, or an inside organizer, at Starbucks, which is the material for a lot of the book. And yeah, it gave me a really interesting perspective into organizing and into how to actually make this happen in your own workplace. Yeah, now I'm working mostly on training other folks on how to organize their own workplaces through the Inside Organizer School, and working with the UFCW in LA now.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a great start. So let's get straight to the book. That's what we're here to talk about. It really strikes me. Sorry, I'm pushing the synergy too hard on the name of the podcast, but it seems to me that this is everyday organizing. So much of the stories we hear about organizing are very, very dramatic. There's that famous Sally Field movie, Norma
Normal,
Ray,
right?
yes. And this book is like texting people, hey, what happened yesterday, right? Like it's like organizing. Maybe it never was like Norma Ray, but it's definitely not now. So can you just tell us what it's like to be? I was going to say on the front lines, but again, on the front line, that kind of military metaphor is the wrong. There's not a
No,
line,
sometimes it's the right metaphor. I mean, it depends on the campaign, obviously, but companies treat this as a war. And, I think when we say no war but class war, the union organizing campaign is certainly one of those battlefields.
Yeah. Okay. So let me try. Let me say again. Then, if you look at uh, the last time wars were waged with these two clear lines was centuries ago, and I think the last time that it was so clear who labor was and who management was. If you can imagine the archetypical factory where there's a rich guy in town and then, I don't know, a scab has come from out of town to organize the workers. It's just what you describe isn't that. The labor capitalism has changed, the workplace has changed, and labor organizing has changed. Although, by all means, tell me what I'm wrong about how it's changed as well.
Well, I mean, I think you're certainly right that, 100 years ago, you had US bosses much more emboldened to use traditional force and to, try to, shoot into strikers, picket lines, and, run them over with cars, and the kind of violence that we see, in Salt of the Earth and other union movies documenting those kinds of miners' strikes, for example. And I think, in some ways around the world, conditions haven't changed that much for union organizing. It's still pretty bloody in a lot of countries that are emboldened by US capital. But yeah, certainly in the US, it's shifted into much more of a psychological warfare battle, where instead of trying to, you know, convince you not to unionize by threatening violence, companies will try to convince you not to unionize by threatening your job, your career prospects, your likelihood of continued employment, and your right to transfer to a store in LA when you go to college, like they did to some of my coworkers. So it certainly, they sent Starbucks sent a team of about 200 corporate managers to Buffalo to try to prevent the union. So certainly there was this kind of force coming into the city, which culminated with Howard Schultz, the CEO, giving us his captive audience speech where he was like, guys, the Holocaust, please don't unionize, uh, which was insane. But yeah, I mean, it is different. And also, in some ways, it's very similar. Like, get on the job and organize itself is an IWW slogan from 1917. Like, a lot of what we're doing is trying to build industrial unionism in very old fashioned ways, because it works, or it has the potential to work in a way that most other things don't.
Yeah, and so my apologies for this as well. I mean, this is very much an on the ground book. I'm very much a theoretical and historical thinker. So of course the part that like grabs me the most is the end of the book, really, where you situate this. And so I mean, really, one of the reasons why it's exciting to have you here is to talk about what things are like on the ground in a way that I can't speak to. I just want to take a second, though, to ask you this big picture question because I can't figure this out, and maybe you can from personal experience. What the fuck upsets these people so much about union organizing? Like, I don't understand what is at stake for these bosses. You could certainly argue that in the long run they could make more money with a union workplace in which the workers are better workers and are invested in the long run with the success of the company. Why are they so upset about this? Howard Schultz, sorry to go on a little bit more. Howard
Yeah,
Schultz
yeah,
was
go for it.
he was a left-wing billionaire, if you could believe it, if there is such a thing.
There's not.
He was, no,
Spoiler.
of course there's not. Of course there's not. But if you'd asked someone about Howard Schultz 20 years ago, if they knew who he was, they would have been like, "Oh yeah, he's one of the good ones." Why is even quote one of the good ones just turn into goddamn Rockefeller when someone is like, "Hey, wouldn't it be nice if we had a say in our workplace?"
Well, I think people in power typically do not want to share power. Howard Schultz, in particular, even wrote about this in some of his earlier books because he's written many books. Many of them are very illustrative of his character. But in one of them, he writes about the unionization that happened in some of the Seattle stores with the UFCW in the 1980s. Um, and he made it his personal mission to decertify the union in those stores where they'd gotten a small foothold. Starbucks was, of course, a much tinier company, so they had a proportionally, it was like maybe 6 stores. Um, and he wrote about seeing this as a referendum on his leadership and his character if workers wanted to unionize. So I think for Howard and for Rosanne and some of the other Starbucks corporate characters, um, this was deeply personal, and they were coming to Buffalo to put themselves in front of the workers and be like, guys, you don't need a third party, as they were characterizing the union. Just trust us. Like, this is about us and our ability to, you know, convince you that you don't need this. I think there's obviously a lot of other reasons why companies don't want unions. I mean, I think, it can be true that workers in unionized companies, are more productive and more happy. And so that, ends up lessening the financial impact. But it's also true that unions exist so that workers can have more of what they're producing. So, I might tell a boss that it's in their interest, and sometimes it is. And certainly it is in terms of, they don't lose the progressive reputation that they have been cultivating. REI has been trying to do woke union busting with their land acknowledgement podcasts, but I think they're losing a lot of goodwill. So certainly there's other impacts that fighting a union can bring to the business. But unions exist so that workers have more, and so that, this new CEO of Starbucks, Brian Nichols, can't be lining his pockets with millions of dollars while people are not able to put food on the table.
Yeah, I mean, I would still guess that the ultimately, to use the stupid metaphor, the pie would get bigger, even if they might have a slightly smaller share of it, which suggests that what they care about then is not the company, is just their own part of it. So that's one of their lies exposed. More importantly, though, I think I assumed it was personal, precisely as you say, and that is, I mean, in some ways, that's just perfect. What's funny is it's supposed to be personal for them, and they are one person, and yet it's not supposed to be personal for the worker, which can be hundreds, thousands, or even millions of people. I don't know how you justify that way of thinking in your head. Oh, it's personal for me, and not realize that it's personal for the people who are, working at Starbucks. But I guess that's just part of the psychology that I am going to continue to struggle to understand.
Well, they would say, that a union isn't individual and, you're paying some outside third party to speak for you. Whereas Roseanne Williams has written her email on the whiteboard in the hotel conference room where they've dragged everyone for this captive audience meeting. So you can just reach out to Roseanne and her open door policy. And, in many cases, she was having one on ones with coworkers and buying them breakfast, even to try to talk to them about why they shouldn't unionize. Um, so, that would be their response. Of course, I think the billionaire psychology, you don't get to be a billionaire unless you're prioritizing your personal interests above everyone else's in the planet. And Howard Schultz was worth $4.8 billion on the day of his captive audience meeting. So when he said that we should be, or when he said that he was sharing his blanket with us at Starbucks, just like they had done in the Holocaust, it didn't quite ring true for people who were aware of his net worth.
Oh yeah, this is astonishing. I guess I do want to bring up, because I'm certainly plenty critical of, let's say, when the big bosses make the argument that the union can be an outside force and doesn't represent the worker. We know historically that that can and has been true. How do you, in this, presumably from the 21st century, we think it was bad that that happened in the late 19th and early 20th century, and don't want it to happen again. This image in American life that unions are not, made up of the worker and a co-op or collective voice of the worker, but unions are a separate organization, a middleman between the worker and the boss. You still probably would rather have that middleman, but that's not the goal, right? So how do we prevent our new labor movement, insofar as it is a new labor movement, from falling into the bad old traps of the 20th century labor movement?
No, I mean, that's a great question. And I think, there's definitely parts of the book that get pretty deep into the more depressing side of internal union politics. And, I think organizing unions requires kind of this almost Wild West mentality of like, okay, we're just going really hard, we're throwing stuff at the wall. We need to be able to, move really quickly. And a lot of international unions are threatened by new organizing and new worker leadership. Um, and, I think that certainly was a dynamic on the Starbucks campaign. It was largely the reason why Tesla workers in Buffalo weren't able to win a union election. So I think unions have to be able to, instead of being threatened by worker organizing, actually do everything possible to support it, especially right now when this might be our only hope of stopping fascism. Um, but I also think there's a lot of people who are very focused on reforming unions from the inside. And that's great, but I think the best way that you change a union from the inside is organizing a bunch of new workers into it versus like, spending your days on internal union battles. Because the Workers United has fundamentally changed as a result of the Starbucks campaign. Everything from, embracing trans rights or labor rights, which was a slogan that um, trans workers in Oklahoma came up with as part of why they were unionizing to um, standing with Palestine, which the International Union was not very keen on doing, but Starbucks workers voted by 97% to put out a really strong statement in solidarity with Palestine. So I think once you teach workers how to organize, they will continue to do that in their union structures too.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And this idea that empowering the grassroots, I mean, gosh, I almost shudder when I hear myself say the word grassroots, because I feel like that word has been almost co-opted to the point that, but establishing workers in, empowering workers in their workplace to take control of their workplace and of their movements to change the workplace. It makes perfect sense to me that people who are doing that for the first time will bring that approach to the union that they are a part of as well. And as far as I'm concerned, there can never be too much of that grassroots organizing in any organization.
No, exactly. I mean, I think um, people who are organizing unions aren't attracted to unions as, institutions or as, the kind of insurance policy unionism that, isn't ideal. Where like, you vote for the union and you get this in your contract and then your role is fairly limited. People are attracted to unionizing because of the ability that it has to transform power dynamics in the workplace, to create to create a democracy in the workplace, to give people a way to try to create the society that they want. And so I think a lot of folks have seen kind of the erosion of the liberal messaging that we were all given, which is part of how Howard Schultz got to present himself as a good guy at one point. Um, and as capitalism has proven more and more how structurally unjust and unsound it is, and as people have no hope for retirement or career progression in the ways that people were promised, um, I think union organizing is people's last hope toward making the world that they want, and also like achieving liberation on all of these other struggles.
Yeah, I can't. I mean, I just agree with all of that. I can't disagree with anything there. I guess the next question for me, as we're thinking about this, is, I mean, how do we think about this new wave of organizing while we're also in the midst of, I mean, the old cliche is to call it the culture war, right? But while there's not just skepticism about unions, as there has been for decades with a large with many people, let's say, there's also this new energy for unions that's risen up over the last couple of decades, which is so exciting. But we also seem to be experiencing some sort of bizarre transformation. They come along every 40, 50, 60 years in the sort of tribes in the United States. At least there's one happening right now before our very eyes, and I'm really having a difficult time understanding. And if the union men, and it basically was men in the middle part of the 20th century, were the bedrock of the democratic, which is to say, social democratic, vaguely center left coalition in, the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Where do unions fit in this new us versus them, that I don't even know who us is and who them is? And I don't like thinking in us versus them policies, but boy, is that like the New York Times takeaway of the world. Where are union organizers in this us versus them? Who are union organizers? How can we present ourselves as the allies of everyone and not on one of these stupid sides?
Well, I mean, I think it's incredibly important that unions, and new organizing in particular, help reframe the way people are thinking about us versus them in a way that prioritizes class instead of prioritizing the othering and the racism and xenophobia and so forth that right wing populists and fascists are trying to encourage. So unions should not be trying to make common cause with fascism. I think that's incredibly important. But unions also shouldn't be in lockstep with a Democratic Party that doesn't know how to talk about class, doesn't want to talk about
Yeah.
class, and wants to divide people into these increasingly narrow subcategories of identity and so forth. I think unions give people a way to actually organize and ensure that their identities and needs are protected, while also uniting everybody around their shared interests and class. I think we've seen Bernie Sanders as having pretty successful rallies, but what is the takeaway from that? The takeaway doesn't need to be anoint a successor for 2028. The takeaway should be organize a union in your workplace and build a class based movement that can challenge fascism. Because that's what's going to save us, not some anointed successor.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I want to get in a second to how you organize a union in your workplace. Before that, though, I guess the last thing on this kind of historic theoretical thing I want to push is I really think, I mean, I wasn't there, none of us were there, but, 100 years ago and 150 years ago, working class people knew that they were working class. They lived together literally. They lived in the same part of town, and then they all went together to the factory district where they spent all of their time together, and then they came home. There was no question that they weren't just economically of a class, but they were socially and eventually politically united in a class. If you're living in the suburbs and driving to Starbucks or taking the bus to Starbucks to work, it's less obvious to you that you are part of the working class. And I think that was part of the old Howard Schultz message is you're in the Starbucks family and we'll take care of you with scholarships. So how do you convince the working class that they are the working class?
Well, I think one thing that's important is people relate a lot more to their understanding of reality than to, talking about broader ideological issues until, you've come a lot further in the organizing process. But I think most Starbucks workers, are pretty aware that the customers spending $20 on their drinks and hundreds of dollars on gift card orders are, in an extremely different world than the barista who's not making, per hour what one drink order that they're ringing up might cost. So I think people do actually understand that inequity. You're told that you should be making 6 drinks a minute, which is not possible. They tell you that so that you feel pressured to work harder and faster. And you're making maybe what two of those drinks cost. So maybe if you're lucky. So I do think that there is a real understanding just implicit in that work of, um, inequality and also how much the company must be making if they're paying you that little. Because, with a company like Starbucks, the costs are not as high. So
Okay, so it doesn't start with this awareness that you are part of this, large, substantial social group known as the working class. It starts with this awareness that in your Starbucks store or in your Amazon warehouse, you are being ruthlessly, brutally exploited, and someone else is making lots of money off that, and it's time to find other people to help you do something about that.
I think that's mostly true. I mean, I think people at Starbucks have typically worked other service industry jobs. And it's true that Starbucks is better than a lot of these other service industry jobs. And Starbucks expected, I think, to be able to ride that wave of the terribleness of the rest of the industry to help them prevent unionization. But I think, it's really important that people know unionization doesn't start from where, the Panera Bread or the other coffee shop down the block is. It starts from where you're at. And so you're bargaining to improve your conditions based on your company. So I think people who are organizing at Starbucks also understood like this industry is terrible, not because we're less skilled, not because it's suddenly, so much easier to make drinks and deal with customers and all of this stuff than to, work in manufacturing or work other jobs, but because there is no unionization, no union density in this industry, whereas, historically, obviously, manufacturing and others have had much higher union density. And so you have higher wages. So the goal of organizing in the coffee industry has been to try to raise the industry standard. And I think that does lead to broader understandings of class and of, the way that companies rely on high turnover and churn. Um, but I think people understand it from their own experience. So like I love the Bill Haywood. I've never read Marxist Capital, but I've got the Marx of Capital all over my body because I think people understand like their personal experiences and then can relate outward from that.
Yeah, no, I think that makes absolute sense. Um, my suggestion is that it's harder to see the class itself arrayed in front of you, but it shouldn't be harder to see at all. The shit that you put up with on a day-to-day basis. And I'm guessing the primary difficulty right now is convincing people that unions can and will represent them, and that there is an option for them to take action and make things different, instead of just try and find whatever the next step is above Starbucks in terms of a service job that has slightly better benefits, maybe.
I think the hard part is convincing people that they're not going to get fired,
Yeah.
or blacklisted, or all of these other things that companies do to try to make people's lives miserable. With Starbucks, they when we say psychological warfare, like they were targeting workers based on what they knew about their mental health situations, their family situations, their educational situations. They were intentionally scheduling people to close one night and then open the next morning repeatedly so that they would disrupt their sleep schedules. And like they drove workers to mental breakdowns. In one case, a worker who was on the original organizing committee died by suicide. Like this was psychological warfare.
Yeah, so I mean, this just takes us back to that problem. They have the power and they want to keep it, and they will do anything to keep it. And the question of rationality hardly seems to even enter into it.
No, exactly. I mean, I think, you know, people in power want to keep the structure that's benefiting them. And I think Howard Schultz correctly thought that if we could unionize a couple of stores, it would have cost them far, far less than what they spent on all of their union busting and also on giving the benefits that we were asking for at the bargaining table, not to us, but to all the other stores so that they could try to say, oh, look, if you decertify your union, you'll get credit card tipping, you'll get all these new benefits. So it cost them more to try to fight the union than it would have to just sign a contract. But I think that they thought, if these stores unionize, it will be a domino theory and, we will have all of these other stores unionizing. And so they were operating in a very kind of, communist containment theory. I'm joking, but
Yeah, no, that
they
sounds that
called
sounds
it
right to me.
containment. They did call it
Yeah.
containment. It's hilarious.
And that's great evidence for any worker who's afraid that, as that fear that the individual worker might have is is quite rational, of course. But when the bosses come and say, actually, this won't be good for you in the long run, we can see from their actions that that's a lie. They know very well it will be good for the workers in the long run.
No, exactly. I mean, it's, you know, the boss is the best organizer, not because the boss wants you to organize, but because people who are afraid of the potential consequences often, when they see how the boss is responding, and by the boss, I really mean Howard Schultz. We had a lot of whistleblower store managers. My store manager was great. We would often say it's not our decision to keep the store manager out of the bargaining unit. That's Taft-Hartley. We didn't support that from the get-go. But the people in power are going to be exposing themselves and their ideas, um, and that really helps move people along. I think there's a chance we would have lost at least one of the an additional one of the first three elections if Howard hadn't given that Holocaust speech, because it really changed people's minds.
Yeah, the boss is the best organizer. Love it. All right, so if someone's listening to this and they want to organize, what should they do?
Well, um, I would advise them to try to find a union that will commit to helping win the right to organize and commit to helping bring down the hammer on the company so that you can win the contract and the right to organize through public pressure. Um, but the most important thing is to move very quickly once you're actually having organizing conversations, so that you can take the company by surprise. Um, and obviously be careful about who you trust, but speed is on your side. Delay only helps the company. So there's steps to organize, which basically involve first building your organizing committee, which is the group of people who are actually going to do the work of talking to coworkers, maintaining morale, collecting union cards, and like helping preempt the boss's propaganda. Even if you're in a small shop, you can't DIY your own union committee. You need other people to be that force with you. Um, and then once you have your committee, sign up your coworkers on union cards, petition for an election with the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, or ask the company for voluntary recognition. Spoiler, they're not going to give you voluntary recognition unless you already have the leverage. So typically you're going to go to the election and then, try to keep up the fight during that period, and then you win the right to negotiate. But very critical that workers are going to have to find the hammer, the leverage, the public pressure to actually force the company to recognize the union and stop fighting, so that they can actually win a contract.
Okay, that sounds great. That sounds like a great place to start. We've actually covered everything I set out to cover. We're a little under time, but that's never a problem as far as I'm concerned. So, Jaz Brisack, what else do you want to make sure you say before we go here?
I guess the other thing I should say is if folks want to organize a union and are wondering how to get started and how to get started in the most strategic way, um, I'm part of a collective of organizers that run a training school called the Inside Organizer School, which has existed since 2018. It was the foundation of the Starbucks Workers United campaign. So reach out to us at any of the Inside Organizer School social media pages or website, and we can help get you connected with a union and help troubleshoot some of those issues.
Okay, and any last thing you would like to say about the book?
Well, I'm so excited that it's actually going to be out in the world now. It feels like, a chapter of my life in a very interesting way. But I really hope that people's takeaway from this is, if they can do that, we can do that. And I think that was the takeaway that workers on these different campaigns had. Once Spot Coffee unionized, Starbucks was like, if they can do it, we can do it. Once Starbucks unionized, people from REI to Amazon to Chipotle, where like if they can do it, we can do it. And then that led to Tesla and beyond. So it's possible. Nobody is saying it's going to be easy, and companies are going to do everything they can to try to prevent workers from organizing. Um, but this is our best chance to win the society we need.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. I mean, so we're speaking now in March. This episode will come out in April, around the time the book is coming out. So who knows, Jazz, what will happen over the next 6 weeks? Because the past 6 weeks have been eventful. But let's just say, no matter what happens in the next 6 weeks, if you've been paying attention to the news, you've seen what the world looks like when the bosses think absolutely no one can do anything to stop them. And as far as the anarchists are concerned, and frankly, as far as history is concerned, the way you stop the bosses is with unions. And that is what we need right now.
Yes. And maybe also a Paris Commune. I think that would also be lovely if anyone wants to be the Louise Michel of our day.
Yeah, well, good luck. Good luck with that. We'll I've covered the Paris Commune. I love the Paris Commune. Let's just say
I know it
I
didn't go so great
yeah.
for them.
Oh, it's not. I mean, that's not what I'm worried about. Who doesn't love a martyr? I can't imagine anywhere in the U.S. having that level of desire to stand up to the bosses. We have become a boss centric country. It is a tragedy,
I
and
don't
we
know.
need to
I don't know.
undo
I
it.
wouldn't be that pessimistic. I think there's potential. I think people who are interested in organizing are also interested in the broader potential of what a society could look like. And I don't know. I think people didn't necessarily see revolution happening before they started to happen. I think people thought that you know Russia was too beaten down, too backwards. It could never happen, and obviously, not. Um, obviously, there was a lot of appetite for revolution. So I think people could surprise you.
Yeah, and I'll say this: no matter what anyone thinks, no matter what any professor says, the world 5 years from now, 20 years from now, and 50 years from now is going to be very different than the world you are living in. And so be ready to make that world you want to live in. That's what Jaz Brisack is doing. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.